Welcome back. Today our focus is the brief but glorious reign of Alexander the Great. As you already may know, his life was one of immoderation, of excess, of all-out adventure, and who succumbed to a very early death, perhaps because of sheer physical exhaustion or overexertion, or simply a very life of hard drinking and hard fighting. He succumbed to his last final illness in Babylon, dying very young at the age of only 23 on June 11th, 323. In any case, Alexander, we'll get into the details of his life. The life of Alexander, the great military commander, raises many broader historical questions than we will look at today. Here are his dates, again, of his brief life. The life of Alexander and the era of Alexandria raises many broader historical questions on the role of the individual in history. To what extent do you think that the course of history is shaped by great, outstanding individuals and their individual actions? Or to what extent is history shaped by broader historical forces? In other words, to what extent do you think that Alexander himself was the crucial factor in creating the world's greatest empire from the Mediterranean to the borders of India? Finally, we might also think about what is that constitutes greatness in history. What is great? Is greatness military conquest? Is greatness synonymous with intellectual achievement? Is greatness about bringing peace and prosperity and toleration to the people? So what we're really looking at today is what is greatness and how can we assess Alexander the Great's historical legacy? As you know, he conquered the Persian Empire to form the world's largest empire yet. But the question that we will examine is at what cost? And how can we draw up a balance sheet of what he achieved at the end of his reign? What ultimately happened at the end of the day, at the end of his conquest in 323 BCE? We might wonder if he actually reached an impasse when he died, because on his death he faced widespread resistance to his policies of cultural fusion. He faced widespread opposition, as we'll look at the end of this lecture, particularly among his Macedonian followers and the Greek city-states. Indeed, historiographically, it has become fashionable to condemn Alexander's conquest as out of hand, particularly in their moral and ethical behavior. Alexander, in creating this world's greatest empire, has been called a butcher of innocence, not great at all, but a terrorist and a hooligan. We might wonder if he was distracted from the business of forming a truly stable government by his marked taste for violence and personal glory. He was most definitely motivated by a desire to sort of achieve something superhuman on the level of a god. So was this quote-unquote great ruler actually incapable of peacefully ruling an empire? One historian has famously argued that in his military aggression, in his very violent reaction to any sort of demonstration of resistance, in his ruthless killing of local populations and the destruction of cities throughout his empire, Alexander was merely a brute conqueror who truly did not seek to be seen as a ruler and as being a conqueror more than a ruler. He failed to maintain an empire and to control it for any period of time. So we might also ask not only if Alexander were responsible for the crumbling of his empire when he died, for unfortunately he died without a male heir, not only for the crumbling of his empire, but perhaps his own excessive lifestyle was responsible for his own untimely death at the age of 23. On the other hand, in terms of assessing his legacy, leaving aside moral and ethical judgments and the way that he occasionally put down resistance brutally, he was tremendously progressive in promoting policies of cultural fusion of Eastern and Western culture. And that is not only bringing Greek culture to the East, but bringing Eastern culture and Persian culture to the Greeks and to the Macedonians. He followed the traditional culture of the place where he was, wherever he conquered. Okay, so we'll be looking at Alexander today, beginning with the background, who he was and how he was able to conquer Greece, actually looking at what it is that he did, what were his campaigns, what motivated him to do this, and finally the legacy. How did the Greeks and Macedonians respond to what Alexander tried to achieve? Okay, so we'll really be beginning with the background, looking at the Greek city-states after the Persian Wars, and how they were really in a period of a long and slow burn. The reign of Alexander comes after a long period of decline and civil war in the Greek city-states. The picture that we will see is this. The Greek city-states will be worn down and brutalized by constant warfare and struggle for hegemony after the Persian Wars, which essentially creates a power vacuum that allows Greece to be conquered by their quote-unquote less civilized neighbors, the Macedonians. The Macedonians are ethnically related to the Greeks, shared in Greek culture in the same religion, but the Greeks, the Athenians, the Spartans, the Thebans, looked at the Macedonians as sort of less civilized neighbors. They have a slightly different political system, as I'll explain to you. But first, let's go focus on the Greek situation. So the roots of this decline were in the Great Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, which broke out in 431 BCE. But in fact, storm clouds had been gathering for some time in the 5th century, and really from the end of the Persian War. And I will add to you that the Peloponnesian Wars, the great civil war between Athens and Sparta, really lasted almost all of the 5th century BCE. The two leading protagonists in the conflict had been allies earlier during the Persian Wars, these are, of course, Athens and Sparta. The Persian Wars, again, are very significant in that they brought the Greek city-states together against a common enemy. And this is crucial to understand where Alexander is coming from. So the Greek city-states putting aside their difference and banding together. After the Persian Wars, Athens and Sparta and some other Greek city-states banded together to form something called the Hellenic League. Now, this was 481 BCE. This is not yet the Delian League. The Hellenic League, simply meaning the Greek League. And this Hellenic League was a defensive alliance created to resist a possible massive Persian reinvasion of the Greek homeland. And the agreement was that the Spartans would assume the joint command of military affairs on land and sea, and that the Athenian navy would contribute the bulk of ships to this military force, about 200 ships, which was more than all of the other cities combined. But from the beginning, in this Hellenic League, relations were always strained between Athens and Sparta because of the clash of the political systems, the way that the Athenians favored democracy and the way that the Spartans favored authoritarianism. So what happens is that in this Hellenic League, the Athenians assumed leadership politically, and gradually Sparta is pushed to the side and decides to withdraw from the league. So the sense is that there's something going on here other than the possible third Persian threat. What's really at stake here is hegemony in the Greek lands and leadership of the Greeks in general. So what happens is that the Hellenic League breaks down into two competing leagues, the Delian League. So the Delian League is headed by Athens. The Delian League is Athens and their allies, and the Peloponnesian League. Okay, the Peloponnesian League is Sparta and their allies. But the new league is the Delian League, created by Athens. It's a new defensive league against a possible reinvasion by the Persians that specifically excluded Sparta. Okay, so in the league, the member city-states, the Delian League and its allies had to pay a tax for the mutual defense of the Greeks against the Persians, and or provides ships in lieu of a military payment. There were about 100 member states in Greece, in the Aegean, and in Asia Minor, and many of which were the so-called Ionian Greeks, which had formerly been under the Persian Empire. So the question was, what was the purpose of this league? Was it truly a defensive alliance, or was it the beginnings of an Athenian empire? Were the Athenians using this league to extend its power and create an empire in the Aegean Sea? This is precisely what the Spartans feared, and this is precisely what happens. The Delian League was essentially an imperial zone of the Athenians. So what happens is that initially the members in the Delian League were all independent and contributed their money or ships for defense willingly, voluntarily. However, within a few years of its founding in 479 BCE, Athens began to strip Confederate states of independence, folding them into an Athenian empire, and compelled those states that provided ships to Athens to provide money instead. Now, initially, the treasury for this league was kept in a politically neutral place in an island in the middle of the Aegean called Delos, the Isle of Delos. However, when in 454 the treasury was moved to Athens, increasingly many member states feared that the Delian League was not a mutual defense alliance, but was the pretext for an Athenian empire that would dominate all of Greece. Now, initially, in addition, I would say, not only was the treasury moved to Athens, it became known that the Athenians were using this defense funding for their own internal purposes. And most prominently, the Athenians were using funds from the Delian League to rebuild the temples on the Parthenon that had been destroyed during the great invasion of Xerxes during the Persian Wars. So the famous Athenian Parthenon to Athena was built during this time using funds from the Delian League by the great Athenian ruler Pericles. Above all, it was Sparta that feared this buildup of Athenian power and aggression in the Delian League. Because of the sheer extent of their power and their claims, how they're expanding through the Aegean, and also because of how the Athenians supported popular democracy among its allies, and Sparta hated this. So among its allies in the Peloponnesian League, the Spartans supported a limited democracy, a more conservative form of government such as oligarchy among its allies, whereas Athens supported democracy among its allies. It aggressively pushed to spread democracy among its member states. Definitely, in this buildup of an Athenian empire, the lowest elements of Athenian society supported the creation of the Athenian empire because this empire was very much reliant on the navy, and this navy promised further employment to the lower classes and possibly further concessions to democracy. Okay, so even before the end of the 460s, The Athens, which had previously been non-imperial, limited in its democracy and in friendly relations with Sparta, gave way to an Athens which was increasingly imperialistic, more radically democratic, and no longer an ally of the Spartans. The spark that would bring Athens and Sparta into open conflict were colonial disputes among the allies of the member states. But in reality, it was really a slow burning buildup of tensions between Athens and Sparta that was ideologically motivated. It's essentially the clash of Athenian democracy versus Spartan authoritarianism or oligarchy. So the most important roots of the Peloponnesian War can be summed up as such, as the Greek historian Thucydides argued in his history of the Peloponnesian Wars. Okay, that's Thucydides again. I'll quote him. The real cause I consider to be one which was formerly kept out of sight. The growth of power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta made war inevitable. So in other words, he's saying that while the surface cause for the war was colonial disputes, in reality it was simply the build-up of Athenian power as expressed in the Delian League. So again, most of Greece will be drawn into this long, drawn-out conflict between Athens and Sparta, which made Greece easy prey for outside conquest and sort of created a power vacuum in which all of the powers would have their resources drained by this constant warfare. So the Great Peloponnesian War of 431 to 404 BCE would be preceded by an earlier on-again, off-again conflict from 460 to 477 BCE, the so-called First Peloponnesian War. And the spark for this First Peloponnesian War was when Athens basically stole, if you want to think of it this way, stole or accepted into its league Megara, which was a city-state which had been formerly a member of the Spartan League, the Peloponnesian League, which defected and dropped out of this league and was immediately picked up by the Athenians. The peace in the First Peloponnesian War was inconclusive. The Athenians accepted Spartan dominance at land, while the Spartans accepted Athenian dominance at sea. But the peace was broken again because of colonial disputes, playing out this long-term rivalry between Athens and Sparta. So again, the most important thing is that the Greek mainland, the Greek city-states are drained and depleted of their resources through this constant infighting and civil war, which let them be scooped up relatively easy by Alexander the Great and his father. The spark for the Great Peloponnesian Wars will be colonial conflicts among the ally city-states. Okay, the so-called Megara decrees and the rebellion in Corcia. The Megara decrees were dealing with the polis of Megara. Athens issued a decree which banned the Megarans, the former Spartan ally, now allied with Athens, from trading with Sparta and her allies. So Athens banned Megara from trading with Sparta and her allies. Sparta viewed this, perhaps rightly so, as an attack on her power. The Corcia rebellion was a dispute between Corcia and Corinth. Corinth was an ally of Sparta in the Peloponnesian League, and Corcia was one of Corinth's colonies. So basically, there was an internal rebellion in Corcia, the details of which we don't need to know. And Corcia applied to Athens for help in rebelling against Corinth. Athens immediately sent ships to aid the rebellion in Corcia. And again, the issue really is not this struggle between Corinth and Sparta. It was a pretext for Athens to play out its long-standing dispute with Sparta. So Athens sent ships to aid the rebellion, and Corinth and the more powerful Spartan ally were furious for the Athenians meddling in these internal politics. So the Great Peloponnesian War was the second of these long-standing conflicts between Athens and Sparta that took up most of the 5th century, and it was more or less an ideological struggle of democracy versus oligarchy. It was a long, drawn-out war precisely because the Spartans had strength at land, whereas the Athenians, with their large navy now, controlled the seas. The democratic leader of Athens during the time is called Pericles, and Pericles had a bold plan for defeating the Spartans. He wanted to consciously avoid infantry battles where he knew that they were outmatched, and attempted to defeat the Spartans at sea. His bold patriotic plan to save the Athenian democracy was that the Athenians should abandon Athens and also sacrifice the agricultural hinterland of Attica, basically let the invading Spartans ravage the countryside and ravage the city, and retreat behind these defensive wooden walls to the port of Piraeus on the coast, which you can't actually see here. So it should give up the city, give up the lands of Attica, and let them ravage the countryside. Pericles planned to use the navy to attack Sparta from the coast, to supply Athens, to attack Sparta from the coast, and also, as it would be cut off from the agricultural farmland, he would use the navy to supply Athens with food from the colonies. Pericles assumed that after 1 to 2 years, the Spartans would give up, and that the people of Athens would be able to hold out that long. Okay. However, what Pericles didn't expect was that the ships that supplied Athens with food brought with them a disastrous plague. So pretty quickly into the war from 429 to 426, the population of Athens would be decimated by a devastating plague that wiped out 1/3 of the population, including Pericles himself. Through his leadership, he tried to encourage the Athenians to rally together and hold out, and Thucydides famously recorded Pericles' so-called funeral oration, and you see this scene here, the famous funeral oration of Pericles, in which he's trying to summon up the courage of Athens to keep resisting the Spartans. And basically, he has a tough message to tell them. This is what he says, according to Thucydides, in this great funeral oration to the war dead. Comfort, therefore, not condolence, is what I have to offer the parents of the dead who may be here. Numberless are the chances to which, as they know, the life of man is subject. But fortunate indeed are they who draw their lot for death so glorious, which has caused your mourning, and to whom life has been so exactly measured as to terminate in the happiness which has passed. Still, I know that this is a hard saying, especially when those in question are of whom you will be constantly reminded by seeing in the homes of others blessings of which you once also boasted. For grief is not felt so much for the want of what we have never known, as for the loss of that to which we have been long accustomed. So it's pretty tough love. In other words, saying, well, they died a heroic death. He goes on to say, basically, this: yet you who are still of an age to beget children must bear up in the hope of having others in their stead. Not only will they help you to forget those whom you have lost, but will be to the state a reinforcement and a security. Never can a fair or just policy be expected of the citizen who does not, like his fellows, bring to the decision the interests and apprehensions of a father. So basically encouraging those who remain to have more children so they could go on fighting the Spartans. So meanwhile, So meanwhile, we have this plague that ravages Athens. There is a disastrous failed campaign against Syracuse, which was allied with the Spartans and supplied Spartans with the grain. There was a disastrous campaign to try to take Syracuse, resulted in the death of 50,000 Athenians. The Athenian military power was essentially crippled by the midway into the conflict, and Spartans moved in for the kill. The opportunistic general responsible for the failed invasion of Sicily decided to make a deal with the long-standing enemy, the Persians. So he crossed sides and formed a deal with the Persians. And we will see this continues into the age of Alexander. The deal was that if Persia supported Sparta in the war against the Athenians, the Spartans would return Ionia, so Asia Minor, to Persia. So thus, with Persian funds, the Spartans annihilated Athens and starved Athenians into submission. So 404, the peace was concluded, the war was concluded. After the peace, the Athenian democracy declined, and Athens would never again be the major political or military power that it was during the age of the Delian League. This Persian meddling in Greek politics was very important. Sparta sought the aid of the Persians, which it used to deliver the death blow to Athens, and this meddling would partially justify Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire. Again, the theme is that this constant infighting among the Greek city-states weakened Greece permanently and allowed Alexander's father, Philip of Macedonia, to gain control of much of mainland Greece. Philip of Macedonia, so here is Macedonia with the capital at Pella. Philip of Macedonia began planning to lead a united force of Greeks and Macedonians against the Persians and claimed it was revenge for the great invasion of Xerxes and Darius. Of course, it would also possess special relevance to the Athenians in that they had been defeated by the Spartans with the support of the Persians. Philip's grand goal of reviving the old alliance of Greek city-states that together had fended off the Persians in the Persian Wars was not only for the Greeks' sakes, but it would solidify his authority as a Macedonian in Greece. Of course, however, Philip's grand dreams would be prevented by his own premature death and his assassination at his own daughter's wedding. So his grand dreams would be taken up by his son, Alexander the Great. Okay, now I just gave you a brief overview of Alexander's early life, and I'll go over this again in more detail. I want to start off by talking about what was this Macedonian kingdom to the north. Alexander the Great was a Macedonian, and how was it different than the Greek city-states? So once again, here is our map, Macedonia, with the capital at Pella. The Macedonians were regarded by Greeks as their semi-barbaric cousin, as semi-backwards. They are ethnically Greek, who claim descent from Heracles. They participated in the Olympic Games. They spoke a dialect of Greek. But importantly, you'll notice they do not have poli. They do not have city-states. It is more rural. And it is not a democracy like Athens per se. It is ruled by a king. Okay, it is ruled by a king from the capital at Pella. The kingship was hereditary through families. And this is a very important point, though. It was never an absolutist monarchy. The king was never a god. The accession of the king required the assent of the army and a council of nobles. So in other words, the kingship passed through certain noble families, but the council of nobles and the high-level army officials had to approve this, had to approve it. So there were some democratic elements within this kingship. The king's power was never absolute. The power of the Macedonian Kings depended on their military forces. The Macedonians are among the first to use a professional army of professional soldiers, not the amateurs of the Greek city-states. Their style of warfare was different than that of the poli of the Greek city-states and reflected the importance of the noble cavalry officers. Philip and Alexander's army was a powerful army of professional soldiers. It was about 40,000 men strong, and they used the so-called Macedonian phalanx. So the Macedonian phalanx was different than the Greek phalanx, as it was not the decisive force on the battlefield that the Greek phalanx was. In Macedonian warfare, the phalanx was used to hold the enemy until the cavalry, the heavily armed cavalry, could make the decisive blow. The Macedonian phalanx was also much bigger. It was in ranks of about 14 men deep and used longer pikes of 13 feet. So while the infantry was recruited from the rural farmers, the heavily armored companion cavalry was made up of nobles who lived close to the king. And these nobles were the same ones who advised the king. Okay. Okay, so that's what a little bit about the Macedonian kingdom. Again, Alexander the Great inherits the great dreams of his father, Philip of Macedonia. And Philip of Macedonia successfully invaded Greece and defeated the Greek city-states at the Battle of Sharona in 338 BCE. Now, already then, the decisive blow in this battle was claimed by his young son. Alexander the Great was at the time 18 years old. And the decisive blow was the cavalry charge led by Alexander. Following the defeat of Greece, Philip formed the League of Corinth. Its constitution was a facade for autonomy for the Greek city-states. It promised autonomy or independence to the member states, but in reality, it marked the death knell, the end of the polis, and the beginning of Macedonian hegemony. So it had a council of delegates from the Greek city-states. The Macedonians weren't represented, per se. The Macedonians were only represented in the person of the king, in the person of Philip, who served as sort of CEO and high military commander. And the members of the League of Corinth had to promise to keep the peace internally. Okay? In other words, they promised not to revolt against the Macedonians, against Philip. Remember, the Macedonians are outsiders. So the League of Corinth was a defensive league headed by Philip as the military commander. Theoretically, each of the member states were autonomous, but they had to provide Philip with a military contingent. The site of where the league was founded at Corinth was not accidental at all. It was very important because this was the site of a major battle of resistance by the Greeks during the Persian Wars against the Persians. So it was here at Corinth, after conquering the Greeks, that Philip announced his plans to exact revenge on the Persians in a war of liberation. And it was a clear effort to drum up support among the Greeks, right? So he is an outsider conquering Greece, but he needs a grand scheme to unite the Greeks together and rally them to his back. His plans were cut short, however, when he was murdered at his own daughter's wedding in broad daylight. Okay, and this brings us to his illustrious son, Alexander, and his possible role in the assassination. Okay, so let's now look at Alexander and his background in some detail. Alexander the Great was born in 356 in July in Pella in the capital of the Macedonian kingdom. His mother was Olympias. Olympias was the daughter of the king of the neighboring kingdom of Epirus, and his father was Philip. Much has been made of Alexander the Great's psychological heritage from both his father and mother. I've put for you a text under the video lecture to look at. It is a text from Plutarch about young Alexander, and you will see that he was a very willful and bold and courageous child. And there's the famous story, which I'll let you read for yourself, of how Alexander the Great famously tamed a wild horse called Bucephalus, and basically won a major bet among his father and friends. But he was also very much influenced by his mother. Ancient and modern authors have emphasized the excessive, irrational elements in his psyches, that his extraordinary, over-the-top character and desire to conquer the unknown related to what he inherited from his mother, Olympias. So Olympias was a devotee of the cult of Dionysus, of course, the Greek god of music and wine and revelry. And Olympias indulged her sensibilities without restraint. This lack of restraint and the idea of dreaming the impossible dream is very important to Alexander. Connected to this, many writers associate Alexander with a concept called pothos. Pothos, that's P-O-T-H-O-S. Pothos is an irrational or insatiable, an unsatisfied desire to excel, to keep going further and higher and pushing oneself to the very limits. So this idea of testing the limits of oneself and testing the limits of one's superhuman and human elements, and this indulgence in taking risk is something that's very important to Alexander as well. One scholar has argued that because of this psychological heritage of excessiveness, of being over the top from his mother, have argued that, quote, the rules of normal psychology do not apply to a ruler who feels the blood of Achilles coursing through his veins. So Alexander, in addition to all of this, absolutely had a love of glory and identified himself with mythological and even divine characters. He particularly identified with the character of Achilles from Homer's Iliad, and wanted to sort of be like Achilles in choosing a short life of adventure rather than a long and boring life of staying at home. So he was absolutely motivated by a personal drive for glory, but clearly there was much more to it than that. It's not all a personal, I don't want to suggest that his entire campaigns are motivated out of, for purely personal motivations. So we've so far talked about his mother, but he's also inheriting his father's inheritance. To put it lightly, he has certain issues with his father. He's in competition with his father. He wants to outdo his father. So I would argue that it was a primary reason why Alexander invaded Persia, formed the world's largest empire, was because he never thought of not doing it. It was his inheritance. He was taking up the paternal legacy of Philip of Macedonia in launching this war of reprisal against the Persians, becoming general of all the Greeks. And he's also taking his father's plans a step further. Now, I mentioned to you before that Philip, his father, would be murdered at his own daughter's wedding banquet, and we'll talk about this more. But Alexander, when he launches this campaign against Persia, when he launches the campaigns against Persia, what his father had originally planned in 334 BC, he would add to this another personal motivation, and actually blamed the Persians for the murder of Philip. He attributed the murder of Philip to Persian court intrigue. what was probably not true. But back to Alexander's early life, Philip had groomed Alexander for greatness, while it was said that his mother taught Alexander that he was himself perhaps a god. Philip often left Alexander in charge when he was away on military campaign. He did that when Alexander was only 16 years old, and also hired him the very best Greek tutors. As you probably know, Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great for 3 years and nurtured his love of Greek literature and mythology. Supposedly his favorite work was the Iliad, and he slept with a copy of it under his pillow and personally identified and wanted to outdo the great Greek hero Achilles. So you may know on his conquest, one of the first things that he does is pass by Troy on the way to Asia Minor, and supposedly made sacrifices to Achilles at Troy. However, his relationship with his father would suffer a setback in 337 BCE when Philip repudiated Alexander's mother Olympias, divorced her, and married another woman, a Macedonian princess named Cleopatra. This is not the famous Cleopatra that you knew of. This is simply a Cleopatra. So Philip marries another woman, and Alexander and his mother are sent packing. They are exiled to Epirus. However, another ruler, a ruler of Corinth, arranges a reconciliation, and they come back the next year. So in 336 BCE, at the marriage of Philip and Olympias' daughter to a nobleman, another nobleman named Alexander, at the marriage of Philip and Olympias' daughter, Philip was stabbed in broad daylight by a young nobleman, a young Macedonian nobleman named Pausanias, during the wedding ceremony. So it is not exactly known whether Pausanias acted alone, whether he was egged on by Olympias, Alexander, or the Persians. So we think that Alexander and his mother Olympias probably had a hand in his father's death, although Alexander would cleverly attribute it to the Persians and use this idea as a pretext to launch a war of revenge and reprisal against the Persians. So in 334 BCE, as soon as he became king, he proclaimed his dreams to the Macedonian nobility to carry on his father's legacy by launching the campaigns against Persia. And we have to keep in mind that the campaigns were launched to preempt any possibility of resistance among the Greeks and link them together in a common struggle against a common enemy. Okay, so while Alexander was arguably great, he clamped down on possible resistance brutally. Okay, now before he started the campaign into Persia, he brutally silenced any Greek city-states in Greece who refused to go along with the plans. Okay, so for instance, the city of Thebes was razed to the ground when it refused to go along with the plans to invade Persia as a warning, as a powerful warning to other Greek city-states to not rebel. Now, how did he do that? How did he achieve what he did, and why? Okay, now here is the extent of his empire, right? He leads a force of about 40,000 men against the Persian Empire. So clearly Alexander was vastly outnumbered and knew he could not afford to make a single mistake. Okay, because he knew that he would not only lose against the Persians, but it would encourage open rebellion at home in Greece. So we might say, how did he do it? How did he win? We might say that he was condemned to win. He could not afford to make a single mistake. So keep in mind with the campaigns of Alexander, Alexander is sort of always fighting 3 campaigns at once against the Macedonians. The Macedonians want Alexander to play the role of a Macedonian king above all and behave like a Macedonian king and prioritize affairs in Macedonia. So he's fighting this war against the Macedonians, against the Greeks, many of whom want their independence, and against the Persians. So to this end, Alexander was well aware of the need to keep Greece guarded and delegated the task of watching over Greece to one of his generals, Antipater, and leaves behind in Greece an army of 15,000 men and infantry. Now, he would face open rebellion from the Spartans. The Spartans never joined the League of Corinth, and the king of Sparta, continuing this tradition of sort of meddling with the Persians, the king of Sparta, the king called Agis III, A-G-I-S, the king of Sparta openly plotted with the Persian king, openly plotted, meeting on an island in the Aegean of how they could band together against Alexander. And the plans of Agis would only be defeated after Alexander's victory at Issus against the Spartan king in 333. So, again, we might argue that Alexander was condemned to win. Now, as I mentioned to you, there were about 40,000 men on this campaign. It was mostly Macedonians. The participation of the Greeks was small, but it was essential in painting the campaign as a pan-Greek struggle. So out of the 40,000 men, there are about 7,000 Greek infantry and 2,000 cavalry. So after the campaign, again, it was sort of necessary as a sort of propaganda or public relations measure to hit home the idea specifically that this was a pan-Greek struggle, a struggle that united all the Greeks. So after his first major victory at the Granchius River, he sent home to Athens a sort of personal gift of 1,000 suits of Persian armor to the Athenians. They were supposed to be set up at the temple to Athena at the Acropolis, and they were sent with a note that said, Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks sent up these spoils from the barbarians dwelling in Asia. So, again, I'm trying to emphasize that these goodwill gestures would increase in direct proportion to the military and strategic problems he faced in the war. So he sent these suits of Persian armor to the Athenians at precisely the time when the king of Sparta is plotting to meet up with the Persian king. So in other words, his goodwill gestures appealing to the Greeks were politically motivated. Now let's actually talk about the campaigns. So I've listed for you some of his major victories here. At the time of Philip's death, a young and inexperienced Persian king, Darius III, ruled Persia. So let's look at Alexander's actual campaigns. He first crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor. He first paid tribute to his idol Achilles at Troy. And his strategy was to gain quick and decisive victories and extract money and supplies from the conquered territories, because he basically had little money. His first major battle was the Battle of Granchius, and Alexander decisively defeated the Persian satraps of Asia Minor and then marched into the capital, or the satrap at Sardis, and liberated the Greek city-states there from Persian control. Now, typical of Alexander's personality, he took risks, he acted very impulsively, and his life was saved there by his very close friend called Clitus. Alexander would suffer major injuries on the campaigns. Next, he met the Persians in marching inward to Syria, and defeated the main Persian army under Darius, Alexander himself led the cavalry charge that broke the Persian line, and Darius fled like a coward to the east. You can actually see a depiction of this battle. This is from a much later piece of art depicting it, but here you see Alexander the Great and Darius being defeated. Darius fled like a coward to the east, and the victory at Issus was a major victory for Alexander because he not only took over the very lucrative Persian treasury, but it gave Alexander hostages in the persons of the mother, wives, and daughters of the Persian king. And he offered these women protection. Okay, so he treated them well. After defeating Darius at Issus, Darius slips away to the east, and he will later pursue him. But next he marched through Phoenicia, and while most of the Phoenician city-states did not resist, Alexander was lenient to those city-states that did not resist, but the great exception would be Tyre. And Tyre resisted for about a week, and after Alexander took the city after a long siege, he killed every man there. So Alexander could be quite brutal if he had to be. Next, he marched into Egypt, where he was hailed as a liberator and was proclaimed pharaoh. And it was here that he first began seriously flirting with divinity. After setting up the new capital city of Alexandria, he consulted the oracle of Amun at Siwa. And while no one knows exactly what happened when he consulted the oracle, he henceforth proclaimed himself a god, the son of Zeus, the Greek god Amun, the son of Zeus, Amun. And this flirtation with divinity would produce stark tension from the senior Macedonian officers who saw this idea of Alexander claiming that his father was a god, these senior Macedonian officers see this as Alexander's betrayal of his true father's, Philip's, legacy. 331, he retraced his steps through Phoenicia and met Darius for the last time at Gaugamela, not far from Nineveh in the upper Mesopotamia. And there he would defeat Darius one last time, and this time decisively. However, he failed to capture Darius and had to continue chasing him to the east. In fact, he would fail to capture him alive, and eventually Alexander found Darius's corpse near Ecbatana, because Darius had actually been murdered by his general, a general called Bessus, a close relative of him who had murdered him. So after Darius is murdered, Alexander actually chases down Darius's murderers and paints himself as avenging the murderer of this Persian king. So Alexander uses Darius's murder as an excuse to make himself the true legitimate heir of Darius and to avenge his murder. So the victory at Gaugamela really marked the final victory against the Persians. Okay, again, Darius was murdered and found in Ecbatana in 330, and it also marked the final submission of Greece. Okay, Alexander likens the great victory at Gaugamela to the great Greek victories in the Spartan War, and once and for all, it put down any possibility of further Greek rebellions. For instance, the king of Sparta would be defeated once and for all at the very same time back in Greece. Then he marches into Babylon, where he was hailed as a liberator, as king of the universe, and there, typical of his policies of cultural mixing, he would appoint a Persian satrap. So he very much followed the Persian policy of accepting the conquered people as equals and using them as administrators. After taking Babylon, he marched into Susa and Persepolis and burnt Persepolis to the ground in 330. Likely he did this to placate the Greeks, to make the Greeks happy, to give them a sort of symbolic revenge for how the Persians had burnt Athens. And meanwhile, he goes further and further to the east, again finding Darius' body and then killing Darius' murderer, Bessos, somewhere beneath the Caspian Sea. But this wasn't enough for Alexander. He pushed further into the eastern satrapies, where he faced very, very, very stiff guerrilla warfare, and on his most daring campaign yet, reflecting his insatiable hunger for the unknown, following the defeat of the eastern satraps here, he pushed into part of the world that was not even conquered by the Persians. And following the defeat of the eastern satrapies, he led his last campaign into India. So he pushed his men over the Hindu Kush through hunger and cold and actually starvation, and defeated an Indian ruler called Poros in probably his toughest battle ever at Hydaspes, where he actually faced an army of a charging elephant brigade. By about 325, 324, his men were exhausted and demoralized and simply refused to go any further into India. So on his way back, when they refused to go further, he took them back through a punishing route through the Gedrosian desert. And it's a big question of why he chose such a route. It probably was a punishment for challenging his authority, because they simply refused to go further on campaign, and also proving that he was as great as Cyrus had been, who also led his men on a similar route. Now, meanwhile, as Alexander pushes eastward, as he goes further and further eastward, Alexander increasingly took on and adopted the features of Persian kingship. He dressed like a Persian king. He followed Persian customs. He followed Persian policies of receiving conquered people into his entourage. So there's a huge source of friction were what was his policies of cultural fusion, how he's blending the culture of East and West, and how he favored Persians with high-level promotions and favors. Okay, so for instance, he began taking Eastern wives. He married a Batracian princess called Roxanne as a method of trying to get the people there to buy into his rule. And he expected his officers to do the same. And now, in the eyes of his men, Alexander increasingly behaved like an absolute ruler, as an Eastern tyrant, and not like a good Macedonian king. And in the eyes of his men, they believed that Alexander had renounced his own father. They had renounced his heritage, and he's now claiming he was the son of a god. So this would result in a number of open conspiracies among his men. Of course, the Macedonian soldiers, they had immense superhuman demands placed on them, particularly during this long and last part of the campaign through the east and to India, as they were facing hunger and cold and pure exhaustion. And increasingly, as they realized that, Alexander actually didn't want to go home, they began to openly rebel and challenge Alexander's power. Now, we begin to see stirrings of discontent after the sack of Persepolis, because many thought that Alexander's sack of Persepolis was a sign that, Alexander had had enough, and after this, we're going to turn back and go home. So the rank and file soldiers are very eager to end the campaign, go home, and enjoy the peace and booty gathered in Asia. So as I mentioned to you at the beginning of class, we want to conclude by talking about Alexander's legacy and the policies of opposition to him, of opposition to his greatness and opposition to his policies of cultural fusion. And this really occurs in the last phase of his campaign. The first sign that something was up can be dated to his sojourn in Egypt when he decided to consult the priest of Amun at the oasis. Again, as we mentioned, no one knows exactly what happened, but henceforth Alexander declared himself to be the son of Amun, which the Greeks simply didn't sit well with the Greeks. In addition, in this very last phase of the campaign, from 330 onward, there was a noticeable change in Alexander's personality as he adopted Persian customs and dress and began favoring Persians as high-level advisors and military officers. So I'm going to go through a series of sort of instances of open opposition by the Macedonians who no longer wanted to go along with Alexander. A good example of this was the trial of Philotas. Philotas was a leading figure, a commander of the cavalry since the beginning of the exhibition. In 330, he was accused of having fomented a plot to kill the king. Alexander himself initiated the trial and called an assembly of the army, and Philotas defended himself brilliantly. But at the end, Alexander forced the defendant, Philotas, at the end of the trial, Alexander had him tortured to force a confession, and he was condemned to death and stoned to death. So the real issue with this trial and execution of Philotas was likely he was not guilty of fomenting any rebellion to kill Alexander, but he was known for opposing Alexander's adoption of Persian customs. So, as I mentioned to you, Alexander could not tolerate any opposition to him and took out Philotas, this long-standing, loyal companion, which really signaled to many of the Macedonian men that something was up. Probably the best-known example of Alexander's increasingly intolerant and tyrannical policies was the murder of one of his best friends, Clytus. This took place at a banquet in Samarkand in the east in 328. There was a violent quarrel with his long-standing friend Clytus, his long-standing friend from childhood, along with his other companion Hephaestion. And Clytus had actually been main commander of the cavalry after Philotas' death. So what happened was Clytus accused Alexander of claiming all the glory for Macedonian victories for himself, and too easily forgetting the part played by Philip, his father, and his generals and the men, and argued that the victories had been achieved by all the Macedonians and not just the leader. So likely he voiced something similar to what Philotas had too. Clytus was defending traditional Macedonian kingship, which was not personal and not absolute, but subject to the advice of the nobles, of listening to the nobles, and some sort of democratic element to the kingship. The idea that the king did not betray arbitrarily like an absolute ruler. So in accusing Alexander of claiming a god as his father rather than his real father, he is clearly accusing Alexander of taking on the trappings of an absolute Oriental monarch and turning his back on the sort of good old Macedonian traditions. Now, you can read about this affair in the primary text. I encourage you to do so. It demonstrates Alexander's personality. He was overcome with anger and seized a weapon to kill Clitus, but immediately regretted it and spent the next day essentially mourning and sobbing in agony over what had happened. There is also the so-called proskinesis affair. Proskinesis was ritual prostration. Basically, that meant that the idea of kneeling and prostrating oneself on the ground, lying absolutely flat on the ground. In Persian culture, this lying flat on the ground was a symbol of social hierarchy, and to the Persians it indicated respect, but to the Greeks it indicated divinity. So essentially, Alexander faces some of his followers who oppose this practice of proskinesis, which Alexander increasingly favored, that his courtiers had to bow down to him on the floor flat. But these challengers argue that Alexander was violating the unwritten law by which the king should not govern by force, and was again claiming divinity. Final two things we will talk about in the opposition to Alexander was the mass wedding at Susa. If you remember, Susa was the other major city in Persia. Without repudiating Roxanne, his other wife, Alexander married two Achaemenid princesses, so two princesses in the Persian royal family. He married Barsine, one of Darius's second wives, and at the same time, his best friend Hephaestion married another daughter of Darius. So Alexander took on two Persian brides as his wives, I suppose, and had 80 of his companions, 80 noble Macedonian commanders, marrying the daughters of other Persian noblemen. The brides were all given rich dowries by Alexander, and at the same time there was this elite mass wedding of 80 of his companions marrying the daughters of Persian and Median nobles. There was supposedly a mass wedding of 10,000 rank-and-file soldiers to more everyday Persian brides. Again, there was an enticement to do this, as Alexander distributed rich presents to the couples as incentives, a sort of dowry, trying to force on these policies of cultural fusion, trying to create this new or mixed Eastern and Western ruling class. We know that after Alexander died, most of the generals immediately renounced the marriage, and the rich presents that he gave out seemed to be a motivating factor. Finally, one of the last incidents before he died that indicated that he no longer possessed the loyalty of his men was the so-called Opus Mutiny. In the Opus Mutiny, Alexander tried to make the Macedonians believe that he could dispense with them at will, and sort of used a sort of psychological blackmail, which worked as a charm. What was happening is that the Macedonian soldiers were jealous against the now mixed army of Macedonians and Persians, as Persian mounted soldiers, as Persian cavalry units who had previously fought as auxiliary units, were now being integrated into Alexander's companion cavalry. And if you remember, the companion cavalry were the elite cavalry commanded by the sort of old school Macedonian nobles. There was tremendous opposition from the Macedonian rank and file that these Persians were being integrated into the prestigious companion cavalry, and the crisis came to a head in the summer of 324 at the city of Opis on the Tigris. And Alexander launched on them a piece of psychological blackmail. So in response to this opposition, Alexander announced to the army that the men no longer fit for service due to wounds or age could be sent back to Macedonia with severance pay. And in fact, the infantry took this as proof that Alexander no longer valued their service and was actually abandoning them for the Iranian infantry. Although, as I mentioned to you, the Macedonians had wanted to go home for a long time. They wanted to go home on their terms, that is, with Alexander, their king, at their head. So during the next few days, Alexander made no attempt to reconcile with his soldiers. He gave them the cold shoulder. He withdrew to his tent, refused the Macedonians access, and showered the Iranians with favor. Basically, as he was giving the Iranians favor, as using them as his royal bodyguard, Alexander tried to make the Macedonians believe that he could dispense with them and that he no longer needed them. So after several days, the Macedonian soldiers presented themselves to the king and humbly petitioned them in the Persian manner of kneeling on the ground to take them back. So essentially, he succeeded in getting the Macedonians to accept what they before had stubbornly refused, as they now begged him to rejoin and to fight with him further. So despite the fact that the Macedonians and Greeks were opposed to this fully integrated and mixed Macedonian-Iranian army, he blackmails them and forces them to buy in. After he is forced to turn back from India, Alexander and his entourage arrived back in Babylon in 323, and after being warned by astrologers and priests of possible bad omens that harm might come to the king, he fell subject to a final illness of 10 days in June 323 BCE, and died on June 11th, 323, after being died for about 10 days. It may have been malaria, and may have been simply being worn out and a life of hard living and fighting and drinking. So ironically, the man who had created this great, large empire, ironically left no clear successor or an adult male heir who could succeed him, and his empire would be split among three of his generals. So his empire would be split among Ptolemy, among Seleucus, and among Antigonus. So Ptolemy ruling in Egypt, Seleucus ruling in Mesopotamia, and Antigonus ruling in Asia Minor and Macedonia. And we will come back to how his empire is split when we look at the Romans. So now I would like you to have a look at the text by Plutarch, Life of Alexander, and our discussion question will deal with that this week. Thank you.